In fact, talking to you earlier, you said to me, and it really struck home, 5 years ago, none of this existed. It just gives a real sense of how fast this has happened. This, agency, this huge chunk of money, all of this road building, the speed of it has been intense. But we'll start with you, Jim, because I guess that speed has been, a fantastic thing, but also a really tricky thing for you. We've had the National Audit Office, you mentioned earlier, look into it. They talk about plans, they use the word rushed. You've got savings that you've still got to make right towards the back end of the process. So I think 70% of savings I've got here target in the final 2 years, so a real challenge there. You've had to expand at this incredible rate, taking on people, and that involves consultants who cost more money and all the rest of it. So for RIS 1, what do you think you're really getting right, and what will you kind of openly admit hasn't worked brilliantly and you need to work on?
Okay, I think on the first thing, and I was ever so pleased to see Alistair put up the imperatives, because I think establishing those and making them stay was hugely important. I think that a lot of management fads come and go, and they have a life cycle of about 2 to 3 years. And the fact that we are still here talking about those imperatives 3 years into Highways England, and that is still the direction of travel, says this is not a fad. It's not going to come and go. We're here for the long term. Very proud of that. I think it has happened at tremendous pace. I actually think that if it hadn't happened at pace, it wouldn't have happened at all. There is a terrible tendency in changes such as this to hesitate at the last moment and pull back from it, and therefore to actually commit to that moment where you are either in the air in your aeroplane or put to sea in your boat or whatever it is. To commit to that, I think, was a huge achievement. I think if you wait until you're completely ready, you never do anything. So one of the downsides of that has been that we focus on those 2 imperatives, but it takes an awful lot of manual intervention and an awful lot of what I call knifing and forking to get to the right result. And therefore, I don't underestimate how hard it has been for people to deliver these sorts of results, and immensely frustrating, because any time you do something that takes more effort than it should take, there's an element of frustration to it. So, my thanks to the people in the room and the people at Highways England who've had to work so hard. And we're asked maybe by ORR for a relatively simple report. But people, because we came from Highways Agency, because we're sort of a £13 billion startup, the hand cranking that has to go on. And then if you fine-tune something, it's not a matter of a couple of clicks on a computer mouse or taps on an iPad. You do have to go back and probably rework the whole thing from first principles. So, the next steps, the next challenge is fixing the IT systems, fixing the reporting systems, getting our asset management strategy linked to our asset management IT systems and processes are the next set of challenges. So I think the things that, have been difficult actually has been the amount of effort to create that success on the imperatives. The other thing I'd say, which is a personal frustration, is the number of times that we have been reviewed. It seems to be that we get reviewed for our own sake, and then when any other part of or any other sector, such as rail, has a problem, we get reviewed again. So we've had countless ORR teams in. We've had the NAO, we've had the IPA, we've had several other organisations all come in and review, and each one of them says there's some work to do. Well, we know that, and then they say, but they're making a fist of it, and we know that too. And the last report we had actually said it would be good if people did less reviews of Highways England. So that would be an improvement I'd look for.
So when people come in, what are the practicalities of being reviewed then? Does work stop a bit while you're explaining to people?
Yeah, you are, everybody has talked about a rapidly changing organisation here. And, you have to take people, and a growing organisation, and you have to take people off the day job to support a review. So it is a challenge of itself. And the irony is that if you hold enough reviews, you actually will create the problem you came in to see if it was there in the first place.
Richard, should we bring you in here? How does it compare, for example, people who don't know, how you would look at the roads compared to how you would look at the railways, for example? Is it done in a similar way, in a different way? Do you review Highways England more often than Network Rail? How does it compare?
So there are similarities, clearly, in terms of the way that now roads reform set up a 5-year certainty of funding and investment, and that's the really positive thing, I think. In terms of our role, we've got a very different role, in fact, with respect to roads compared with our rail one. So in rail, we are a full-blown economic regulator. In roads, we have a monitoring role, and that's quite different. So we don't set the outcomes and the outputs that Highways England needs to deliver in the funding, but we actually, we have a real role in kind of influencing, providing evidence to support what is the right level of funding, and we can influence government in terms of looking at what are the key things that road users want from the network. So there are some similarities and some differences. I think, in terms of our role in roads, we are a much smaller team. We take a different approach to our rail role. In terms of Network Rail, it's been regulated for many years now, and it's gone through several sort of equivalent to road periods, control periods. In terms of roads, well, Highways England is just starting out on that journey. And as we've talked about sort of several times now, it's really going up the learning curve in terms of planning for the long term, making sure that it's got the right plans over the 5-year period and actually beyond that. And also in terms of its asset management. It's got plans in place to improve its asset management capability, and we really strongly support that.
You talk about asset management, that's a big problem with the railways as well. I mean, Network Rail still doesn't know what it owns. They've still got people walking around with iPads kind of punching in numbers about we own this bridge. Is that what you mean? Is that actually assessing the condition of each road, each bridge and so on? Is that what you don't think they're doing very well?
So there are the fundamentals about just understanding what assets you own and the condition of them. And that's obviously where you have to start if you're going to develop a robust plan for how you're going to manage your assets over the long term. But it's not an issue which is kind of particular to transport. You see the same things in other utilities. Certainly I've worked in gas and electricity distribution and transmission before, and actually understanding your assets sounds simple, but it's a real challenge.
Anthony, we'll bring you in here. You've talked a lot about the user and how fundamental that is. In fact, all of you have. It's the people driving along the roads really that are important. But isn't the reality, and do you accept that people have got to make money, they've got to make profits, it's expensive, and actually it's quite hard to quantify whether a user is satisfied or not, and actually often money takes precedent over satisfaction levels, for example.
Don't tell anyone, but our business model is deceptively simple. We go and ask people what they think. We write it down, then we publish it. And we say, do more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. It's incredibly simple and incredibly powerful. And I don't think it's difficult at all. I think people respond very openly and very simply to questions like, are you satisfied? What do you think about the road surface quality? What do you think about the information? People are just very honest and open, so I don't think that's the difficult thing. I think it's terribly important where you've got relatively monopolistic suppliers that they have that independent feedback loop, because otherwise there's a danger they talk to themselves and it all looks quite rosy. And I think Jim's been very good at trying to open up Highways England to getting the user voice centre stage in order to drive change. So no, I don't think there is a clash. I think where the clash is the amount of external pressure. The railways, which is a minority provider of transport, generates a huge amount of media coverage, as you know, Richard. The buses generate slightly less. Roads, the road user voice is very diffuse, it's very local, it's very kind of hard in sometimes. It just doesn't appear on the BBC website as often. So I think getting that voice much more focused and much more unified is what we've been trying to do, because the road user, I think, over the years has been very well represented by motoring organisations, RIS, who talk about fuel and price of fuel and all sorts of other things. They've been the haulage industry has been very well represented by its trade associations, but the voice of the driver, the person using the service, I think has been underplayed, and that's what we're trying to bring in. But it's essentially consumption. People are consuming the roads. They're Jim's customers, and therefore, what are the expectations? What do they like? What don't they like? That's what we're trying to bring to the table.
It's part of the problem that you can't win. If you want nice roads, you've got to have roadworks, and people hate roadworks, and therefore will say they're dissatisfied.
Yeah, it is always a challenge that the welcome investment causes disruption and people don't like the disruption, but it's how you do it. It's how you tell them about it. You tell them about the length of the roadworks, why it's being done, what the improvements are going to be, and avoiding that thing that people always say to you, you know, the cones are out and I can't see anybody working. And I'd say it's a trite thing to say, isn't it? But of course it is, you know, people just jump to the assumption, oh, they're just doing it for their convenience. You know, it's just a cheaper way of doing it. Now we know the concrete's drying or whatever, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think trying to communicate those things much more is going to be key to the next period, because the welcome investment must be done in a way that doesn't so irritate the users that they think they'd rather not have the investment.
Okay, we'll get some questions on RIS 1 in a second. So if you have a question, if you can put your hand up and we can get a microphone to you. And I'll just quickly ask Alex if we can get a microphone over here to this chap here. But before you speak, while we're getting that to you, I'll quickly bring Alistair in here so you get a go as well. I mean, you know, you talk about steep learning curve and all the rest of it. Do you really feel that you're sort of getting that? I know you're in a tricky situation. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. You know, you've got to be political about these things. But do you think that you're getting there now? That actually the pipeline is there, that you're able to get your staff in place, and you're basically getting the information you need to do a good job now?
So let's have a look at a bit of context here first. The water sector has probably been through, 6, 7 of these equivalent periods, and I would say it's still trying to get its head around getting it right. So I think the progress that Highways England has made in less than one period is tremendous, and I think the industry has responded to that. I think certainly I would believe, would be ready to deliver RIS 2, whatever it looks like. I mean, clearly if it was 10 times the size of the current programme, that would be challenging, but while I would love that, and I would strongly encourage the government to spend that amount of money, I think realistically that's not going to happen. But within a scale of magnitude, I think industry is ready to deliver, but it goes back to those imperatives. Not only are they ready to deliver, they know what they have to deliver. They know what's important, because it's not just the imperatives, it's the KPIs that sit below that, and there's a laser-like focus on that's what's important. And it's probably taken 2 or 3 years to get to that point, but there's almost an industry working lockstep, and not just the industry working together, working with Highways England, working with their supply chain below them, all focused on the same agenda. There's always going to be challenges. Let's not pretend that everything's going to be sweetness and light, but I think genuinely I'm amazed by how far we've gone in such a short period of time.
Great. Yes.
Thank you. Stuart Westgate from Nichols. One of the main objectives for the creation of Highways England was to get massive investment into roads infrastructure, and in so doing encourage supply chain to resource up, increase capacity, etc., in a way perhaps that rail has struggled to do. Do we still recognise this as a key part of the vision? And Jim, do you see a constraint in getting shovel-ready schemes out to the supply chain? Is that an obstacle there, or are you on track to get that higher level of investment out there?
Okay, I mean, there's 2 parts to that question. The first, the resource challenge. I think there are two things. The first thing about this sector is that it grows organically. It's something like about 20% of the work is delivered by the Tier 1 contractors, and everybody else, for us, sits below that, and they grow organically. It is relatively straightforward. It's a challenge, but it's relatively straightforward for these smaller firms to add people, add machinery, providing they know and training, providing they know they've got the work coming. So that's one half of the resource challenge. The other half, which we're going to see coming into RIS 2, is the automation challenge. We're already looking at automating our control rooms and keeping our staff ahead of the automation. The ultimate objective is to have them like air traffic controllers managing the traffic flow. And as the automation delivers, we move the people on to the next level of skills so that they stay employed in front. So the automation is going to free up designers. One of our objectives for RIS 2 is that emergency refuge areas on smart motorways should be modular designed. And at the point you click from component parts. At the same time as you have designed that, it goes to the on-site so that they can get the earthworks right, and it goes to the factory to actually either select the components or build them. So automation is going to free up resource. So the first part of that of that question is to get the resources to ride the automation wave such that we develop people, improve people, and get the people we need to get the work done. And I think, actually, if we're skilled enough and clever enough about that, we can crack that. We will not end up with too many people who then get laid off by automation, or will not end up by short of people while we wait for automation to come along. So that's one of our challenges, and we owe it to people to crack that. The second one, in terms of the volume of work, is that we're seeing the ramp up. I think people are delivering it. The aim for RIS 2 will be to be slightly bigger, interpret slightly however you will, and flat across the 5 years in terms of expenditure. Because what the supply base has said to me is they want stability. They want a bit of growth and stability. So we're aiming to try and get it level across RIS 2, and then probably to look to the future of 3, 4, 5, to have it at about that level or maybe a little bit higher. One of the restrictions we're facing, which is the customer point, is I don't think the road network can take much more. It is a major economic tool, and therefore you have to be very, very careful about how much of it you have throttled off, restricting the economy at any given time, which is what we actually end up doing, with narrow lanes and speed restrictions.
Okay, anyone else want to talk about the supply chain and the pipe through?
Well, I mean, it's in terms of from the contractor's point of view, I mean, I mentioned earlier, we kind of made a commitment that if we had this in place, we would be ready. So it would be remiss of us to now turn around and say, I'm really sorry, we can't resource to meet that demand. I think it is easier to do that where there's a bit of foresight of what the workload coming down the pipeline looks like, but I think some of the structures that are being put in place allow that to happen. So yeah, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are ready to deliver, because I think it's been touched upon earlier. What we don't want to do is now drop the ball and say, well, I'm sorry, we weren't able to deliver, but we'd like you to continue investing at the same rate, because it was a very politically brave decision to create Highways England. You look back at the context now, the context then to where we are now, I don't think we would have been able to get it through with everything else that's going on in Westminster at the moment. So I think in order for that to be sustained, we really need to be showing delivery.
And Jim, you have had to readjust some of the projects you're doing at the moment and bring some forward and push some back and so on. Is that going to be a constant process, or is that, because it's the first one and you're not used to what you're doing?
I think it was a one-off exercise for RIS 1. There is inevitably minor tuning that goes on. We do listen to customers, and therefore when we go out to consultation on what we believe is the best route, I can think of at least 2 or 3 occasions where we've gone, if that's how people feel or if that's what people's telling us, we've got to change that route. And therefore that moves schemes around a bit. For RIS 2, we're in a better place because I think that instead of a ramp up of work, we should have a constant flow of work, and therefore we can place the individual schemes within it better. I think that, so what I think I'm saying is that this toing and froing, there'll always be a bit of it. You will never nail everything down completely, but it should decrease as we have a longer timescale to work with.
Richard, we know you go in and inspect Jim's offices and so on, but do you go into supply chain offices and talk to them, and how far down the line do you go?
Yeah, so we do. We certainly we make sure that we go out and speak to the supply chain. We've actually done a couple of studies ourselves looking at supply chain issues and actually how Highways England is interacting with the supply chain. So it's really important for us to understand both how ready the supply chain is to deliver this ramp up of work, and also how Highways England is engaging with the supply chain to make sure that everyone is ready. And actually, out of those reviews, one of the big things that came out is about just getting that certainty of future work by getting the pipeline of schemes more transparent, seeing what we can do in terms of bringing forwards the kind of contract horizon. So that's thinking about other ways in which we can involve the supply chain earlier or contract with them earlier. And actually, one of the other concerns that came out of the studies that we've done has been around whether there are the resources within the industry, and what can we do about actually making highways a really attractive place for people to work, so that we're getting in the right skills, the right people, so that we can deliver the ramp up.
Yeah, skills is going to be such a big issue over the next 2 days, I think. Andy, that's not an area you'd stray into. Would you go out and survey companies
no, we
rather than
don't,
people?
but we'd like to talk more to the supply chain because, of course, the suppliers are pitching to Jim to deliver services, and the more they are aware of what the users are saying in the front line, I think it'll make them more effective bidders, quite frankly. So we're happy to work with Alistair and colleagues to try and get our messages out more into the supply chain to drive that innovation and that value. And as you say, move towards that holy grail of stability. That's what it's really good to be boring. You want to know what you're doing when, and you can start to get some of that value for money in there, and start to get and keep the politicians probably where they ought to be, which is slightly at arm's length. It probably doesn't feel like that for Jim, but compared to the railways, it strikes me the politicians are quite a bit further away from the roads, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting how in the railways, customer satisfaction is such a big part of winning a franchise now.
Yep.
Such a major. Any other questions on RIS 1 for now, before we move on to RIS 2 and what we can expect? Yeah, can we get a microphone to this guy? You couldn't have been in a worse place because you were the sprint.
Hi, thank you very much. Rob McCartney from TSP Projects and also from CIHT. A question for the panel generally. There's a lot of feedback coming through. Does it sound okay elsewhere? Okay. What is the industry doing about connectivity? I think, Anthony, you mentioned that everything arrives by freight, by truck at some stage. So it'll obviously come off a boat into a port, be transferred to an inland port, either by road or by rail. But then how does it get back onto the strategic road network and then to the shops and ultimately into our homes?
Yeah, so.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because this is, we've been thinking about this and wrestling with this topic for about the last 12 or 18 months. What are we about and what is the offering? And there are two phrases. In terms of what are we about as a company, the phrase that we've landed on is connecting the company. Connecting the country. Connecting the company would be good too. But connecting the country. And we recognise that we only form a proportion of the journey. And therefore we need to think about the other bit of the journey too. Now that thinking has led government to talk about the major roads network, and we have encouraged the Rhys Jeffries stuff. So we've encouraged that because the major road network in all probability is the next thing you're going to touch after the strategic road network. But if you're going to an airport rushing for a flight, congestion is far more important, and the safety features of that road are far more important than if you're visiting a garden centre or an out-of-town retail park. So we're starting to think, what is your final destination and how do you get there? And likewise, where have you come from? We're starting to talk about local road networks as distributor and collector networks. So connecting the country, we haven't put that into the public domain. It's on the video outside. We haven't put it in the public domain because, quite frankly, its weakness is people think about broadband and telecoms. So that it works for us in terms of thinking about manufacturing to ports, airports. Car factories are very topical at the moment, ensuring that we have a route post-Brexit to ports and into Europe and out to America and beyond. So connecting those final points using our network as the main piece, but being aware of the others is important. The second thing we have come up with, which we are using much more publicly, is we care about your journey. And we don't care about the bit that's on the M1 or the M4. We care about where you started from, where you're going. We care about why you're making that journey, and we care about what it's for. So that is much more our public offering, our offering to the individual road user or consumer. So those two things say that we are thinking hugely about connectivity and about the total journey, not just the bit that's on our road network.
How do you connect it up? Because you've got, you guys, and then potentially this major roads network, and then you've got council roads, and it feels like they're very separate.
And I think they are, to some extent, but I think you end up with a sort of a fuzzy line between the two. So if you take the conversation about the major roads network, there is no intention to take those away from the highways authorities. It is recognised as a map. It is then left with the highways authorities. The highways authorities understand that they have some pretty important roads in their area, which are probably going to be given central government funding in order to lift the standards. So you've got a major road network, which is actually managed by 100 highways authorities and centrally funded. So you don't end up with a hard dividing line of Highways England, strategic roads, central government, local roads, local funding, local priorities, and never the twain shall meet. This major road network starts to smear that boundary, so improvements will be centrally funded. We can help with some of the economic analysis of how those major roads are treated, but they will remain with the local authorities. And I think smearing that boundary is going to be quite helpful.
Can you see a world, though, where in the end one agency looks after the roads, and
No.
that's it?
No. And I think the reason for that is that if you go to the most major of our roads, which is probably something like the M6, connecting the northwest to the Midlands and part of the route beyond, I think it is absolutely important that the regional, local and national priorities on a road like that are, everything's taken into account, but they're settled with the national priority of connecting Scotland to London as being hugely important. But equally well, I think when you get down to roads like the A127 in Essex, the regional and local priorities need to be at the top of the heap. You know, serving the local community with those roads is much more important than the national need. So I think it is appropriate that you put the challenge in front of people who have the right mindset, the right priorities, and then at the boundaries between the two, you have to manage them differently. But the priority of a residential street is hugely different to the priority of the M6.
Alistair, is it a very different experience, you know, being involved in a project with a big A road or motorway than being involved with a small council road?
There are similarities and differences. I think where we would see one of the major differences is, I'm afraid to say at a local level, there has been a denuding of capability in terms of the organisations developing some of these schemes. So when
that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. And that's not the case across it. There are some brilliant local authorities who are doing fantastic schemes, but in some cases, they just don't have the capability, and it's not a criticism, it's just they don't have the resources to have that, or to carry that capability to deliver major schemes. So for a number of years, what we've been quite keen to see is the sharing of best practice between Highways England and other infrastructure organisations with those local bodies so that they get the outcomes they want for their constituents in that community, but they benefit from the knowledge of how to deliver effectively that does sit with some of these other large organisations.
Anthony, do people realise that they're all run by different people, and is there a big differentiation between how people feel about the bigger roads and the smaller roads?
Well, we don't really know because we don't survey the other roads. I mean, you're quite right. The strategic road network is a bit of an artificial construct because it's got the motorways in it by and large and some of the A roads, but not the others. I think what's interesting is when you're looking at some of the new regional bodies that are emerging are starting to talk about the major road network, and David Cornby and others have been very powerful about expressing the need for that second tier of roads to have an equivalent level of attention to the strategic road networks. There's no point in driving off the strategic road network down a pothole which you never emerge from. People don't see it that way. They don't even know, they don't by and large know which bit of the road network they're on because it doesn't matter to them. But I think the more that Highways England is able to get some sort of gravity in this area and some sort of effectiveness, it'll filter out slowly to the other parts. And of course, Highways England is charged in potentially spending money off the strategic road network to help the strategic road network. And I think that's a very powerful change of thinking. It's not so, you haven't got the money locked into these boxes so much anymore. But I think it's a very good point about connectivity. And I think the logistics sector, to a degree, is a victim of its own success because working with them is fantastic. They're very positive people. They literally deliver. And they get on with the infrastructure as they find it. But I don't think they complain enough because when you see some of the access to some of our ports and places, boy, we really sweat our assets in this country, don't we? We just keep using them and using them, then we think about 10 years too late. Why don't we invest some money in it? It needs more thinking. You're quite right.
Okay, I want to move on to RIS 2 quickly. I know we've sort of touched on it, but I want to go into a little bit more detail if we can. So Jim, first of all, I mean, is it possible to say how different it might be to RIS 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think for this audience, the procurement channel is probably the most important. The first thing is that having successfully ramped up this sector in RIS 1, we want to see it maintain that size and capability through RIS 2. So the sort of RIS 1 has been a bit of a triangle. RIS 2 is almost a rectangular funding. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've listened very carefully to what people have told us about the procurement in RIS 1. Now, it worked. It was fit for purpose. We have achieved great things. But we recognise that there are things that could change in that. So the first thing we're changing is that we used a thing called collaborative delivery framework in RIS 1, and it was one size fits all. almost everything we procured came through the pillars of professional services, design services, less than 50 million, more than 50 million. And we even got to the point where the £1.4 billion scheme, that is the A14, had to be force-fitted into that procurement mechanism. So for RIS2, we've said, do you know what? That's not going to work. We need dedicated procurement mechanisms. So so we've broken that out, and there'll probably be 5 different channels. Lower Thames Crossing and A303 will be single-purpose vehicles because they're big and complex. They may or may not involve some private funding, and if they involve private funding, we will have the people putting forward the money will want to be part of it, so they'll have different governance arrangements. So for those, it's different. For the named schemes, the big construction work that was the heart and soul of CDF, we've been talking about a thing called routes to market. And the basic change is that we're going to move from functional columns to regions. We're probably going to have a single designer and two construction companies involved in each region. The reason for the single designer is that one of the other things people have said about RIS1 is that somebody designs the scheme and then they hand it over, and it either has difficulties in construction or it's not deliverable, and the designer has moved on to another scheme. So the proposal for routes to market is that having designed the scheme, they then stay with the scheme through its delivery. So that's another change we're looking at. And then finally, we know that the construction industry does not like bids. They take a lot of work, consume a lot of labour that could be doing other more useful things. So we're trying, and it's proving very, very difficult, but we're trying to find a way where once those contractors are in that region, providing the performance continues to improve and unit costs continue to reduce, we can allocate the next work between those two contractors on a performance basis. Now that's difficult because the way the government procurement works, we have to define all of that up front. And then, one or two of the members of this audience can be quite litigious and have a very strong sense of fair play. So having set the damn thing, we're stuck with it for 5 years. If it's not right, the opportunity to change it once we've put the companies in place is quite limited. So we have to get to that by about February or March next year. So those are the sorts of major changes that we're talking about for RIS2. Then if I go to the other side, for the supply chain, if I go to the other side, with government, we're talking about what we're calling swim lanes of activity. So we're talking, I don't know, 400, 500, 600 million pounds a year of renewals. And historically, when a big project like the Lower Thames Crossing came along, we would dip into that renewals budget and we might almost stop renewals for a year or 2 years while we needed the cash to fund a major project. In RIS2, that's not the plan. That renewals activity will carry on as a continuous flow of work, and the peaks and troughs of major project funding will be done by flexing government funding or by using private finance. So this idea that the funding is level, but the individual streams within it are subject to shocks is something we're trying to bring an end. So there's that. Then we'll establish a capital maintenance fund so that we don't get schemes just coming out of the woodwork where we need to do a big repair and we're cancelling maintenance for that. There will be a constant flow of capital maintenance. Smart motorways, we're going to try and turn that into a factory with another constant flow of funding. And then we've got to organise the planning of what I call the name schemes or the regional investment programme to try and keep those pretty constant. So there are significant changes coming for RIS2, both in how we manage the funding and how we allocate the work.
The last couple of minutes, because a few people here need to get off and do presentations. Let's come along the line and basically say what you want to see, what's a big priority for you in RIS2. So starting with you, Richard.
So I think Jim covered some of our priorities. So clearly there's a lot of schemes starting in RIS1. There's a lot of schemes starting around the boundary between RIS1 and RIS2, and there'll be a clear need to make sure that those are actually delivered during RIS2, and that will take up a lot of the funding that's available. Clearly there are some very big schemes coming along as well, the Lower Thames Crossing and the A303. Actually making sure that those are funded or financed in the right way and delivered will be a huge thing for RIS2. And the other thing which I wanted to draw out, I'm particularly interested in making sure that, as Jim said, there is that steady progress in terms of maintenance renewals activity, making sure that that isn't used as the balancing item for delivering big schemes. Actually, it's really important that the current network is maintained and renewed, And then the sort of the major schemes are the nice to haves and the things that you can build on top of that once you've funded the basic maintenance and renewals of the network.
Anthony.
I think the road user would want to see three things in this 5 years, one of which, of course, is the constant ongoing attention on safety and trying to drive down both the numbers of killed, seriously injured, and the number of incidents. I mean, that obviously has got to be number one priority. Number two is the maintenance of journey times in the face of doing a huge amount of work to improve the network and in the face of rising traffic levels. So that's going to be a real balance and a real challenge. And the way that roadworks are done, the way they're communicated is going to be very, very important. And the way that unplanned disruption is cleared up and the speed at which it's cleared up is going to be very, very important. And finally, just making sure that the road user voice is really built in to the road investment strategy too, in a way that it hasn't been done before. So that voice really drives change, drives performance, and drives how people think about the network in a way that they haven't before.
Alistair?
So there's first the cynical answer, which is we've got a good track record of our members delivering for Jim. I'd like to maintain that. But the honest answer is, I think one point touched on there was safety. I would like us to deliver everything that we do in RIS2 safely. All of our workers go home safely, but also those that are using the network as well. I'd also like the people that are doing the delivery to a bit more reflect the communities that we work in. Diversity in our sector is, well, I'm looking at a room, and it's not quite as diverse as the community around where we are. I'd like that to change over the next few years. But most importantly, and it goes back to where I came in today, I'd like the why to become much clearer. We'll be a success if at the end of RIS2, when I speak to people about the highways network, people are speaking without being prompted positively about their experience of the highways network. So that's what I'd like to see from RIS2.
Fantastic. You're on the Burgess Salmon stage in 10 minutes, aren't you? I think that's right. So people go along to that. Jim, are you speaking? I think you might be speaking as well.
I'm not sure.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't think so, actually.
We're back at 11:50, so we're going to be talking about the subnational transport bodies. We're going to be talking about the major roads network, which we talked about today. And we've got a perspective from Scotland as well to find out what they're doing in Scotland. So please say thank you very much to the panel.